What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to take another look at the Cricut Innovate E5G about a year after my original review and go over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy at this point. Now, as always, if you end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now at this point at the end of 2023, this phone does technically have a successor that, in my opinion, is pretty much exactly the same. But despite this, as of right now, Cricut does still offer it, and I feel like for what it is, it definitely still is a pretty decent phone. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.6-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So on one hand, maybe not the most premium image quality, so if you're doing stuff like watching videos, for example, where the image quality is a bit more important, then you can definitely do better. Especially now in late 2023, there's so many entry-level devices that have 1080p resolutions, so honestly, if that really is something that's important to you, then you will want to skip this phone. But of course, not everyone really needs a super nice looking image, and despite only being 720p, it does at least look decent, so if you're watching the occasional video or maybe going on social media or something, it will still at least get the job done. And at 6.6 inches, the display is pretty large too, so again, on one hand, if you really want the nicest looking image and more of a premium experience, then yeah, you will want to get something else, but of course, this is a really entry-level device, and it's not really meant for that kind of heavy use anyway, so if you're really just looking for a decent display that works for stuff like reading, web browsing, and again, maybe the occasional video or something like that, despite not really being anything special, it will at least get the job done. Now for storage, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely not bad here. On one hand, at this point in 2023, there are lots of really entry-level phones, even around this general sub $200 price range, that do have 128GB, so if storage is really a main concern for you, then you might want to get something else. But at the same time, I feel like for the average person looking for a more entry-level phone like this, 64GB is still going to be perfectly fine. I mean, again, a phone like this that you can easily find for under $200 is really not going to be meant for super heavy use or like mobile gaming and stuff like that that typically takes up a lot more space. So if you are looking for a more basic device for more basic activities, then in that case, I do think the storage on this phone will be at least okay. And again, like many Android phones, it does also support microSD card expansion, so if you're taking lots of photos and videos, for example, this definitely will make a difference. With the Cricut Innovate E5G, up front, we got a 5MP selfie camera, then on the back, we get a dual camera setup with a 13MP main camera and a 2MP depth sensing camera. So yeah, not really the most feature-packed camera out there, but at the same time, I feel like for a phone like this, that is really to be expected. That being said though, I was disappointed to see we're not even getting a macro camera here, because usually I feel like even entry-level phones like this do have macro cameras, but again, we're only getting a main camera and a depth sensing camera. So if you are looking for any other features besides regular photo mode and portrait mode, you will want to get something else. But I will say, despite really not having a ton of features, the photo quality we're getting with this device is actually pretty good. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the Cricut Innovate E5G, and again, for what it is, I do think the photos are pretty good. Now, of course, compared to a much higher end device, photos taken with this phone are obviously not going to be nearly as good, but at the same time, I mean, if you're considering a phone like this, then more of a mid-range phone like a Samsung Galaxy A54 5G, for example, is probably not going to be on your top priorities list. So in general, I feel like when it comes to phones like this, despite maybe not being the absolute best, it does still get the job done. So if you are looking for a really affordable phone and you're not really that concerned with the camera, but you still want the ability to take a nice photo when you need to, then in that case, the Cricut Innovate E5G will definitely get the job done. For the RAM and processor, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now, it's worth mentioning that the successor, the Cricut Magic 5G, that phone actually has pretty much the exact same setup here. So just in case you're wondering, maybe you already have this phone and you're considering upgrading to the Magic 5G. Again, you can see this in my comparison between the two phones, but I would definitely not do that. Again, they're pretty much the same besides the software and I think the display's refresh rate. So yeah, honestly no real difference. But in general, despite being a relatively old processor for what it is, the Dimensity 700 is still pretty good. So for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and even some light mobile gaming, it will get the job done. But if you're really going to be on your phone a lot, especially doing more demanding activities, you will want to get something a bit higher end and just faster in general. Now I ran a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. Now what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance wise compared to your current device. Because of course, depending on what you're coming from, it may or may not actually be a performance upgrade, but I would say if you're coming from maybe an older but higher end device, then this phone will probably feel like a bit of a downgrade, because even though something like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example is pretty old by now, a phone like that is still going to be much faster than this. But on the other hand, if you're coming from more of a low-end device, then chances are this phone will be a pretty solid upgrade. So it really just depends on what you currently have. But again, I feel like for more normal daily activities like web browsing and social media, the speed we're getting here will be at least good enough. Now for the battery, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we're getting a 4000 mAh battery that also supports 10 watt fast charging. Now, honestly, when it comes to the charging, 10 watt fast charging in my opinion is barely even fast charging at all. But despite this, I will say the charging speed is at least acceptable, but don't expect anything super good, so if that is important to you, you might want to get something else. In addition to this, in case you're wondering, the Cricket Innovate E5G does not have wireless charging, so if that is a feature you're looking for, you will want to skip this phone. And now when it comes to the battery size, on one hand a 4000 mAh battery is not particularly impressive, but on the other hand it's not terrible either. It's really just right there in the middle, so if you are looking for a phone that has a really large battery and tons of battery life, then you can do better than this, because at this point in late 2023, honestly very few phones besides maybe some flagship phones are going to have anything other than a 5000 mAh battery. At this point that really is more of a standard, but when you get to really low end phones like this, sometimes they do have smaller batteries, so it's not really that unusual. But at the same time, I guess the point is if you really want a phone with a larger battery, even in this price range, you will have a few options. But that being said, again, the battery life with this phone, despite not being the best, is really not terrible. So again, if you're looking for a phone for more basic activities, you're probably not going to use up the entire battery just by doing stuff like browsing the web or checking your email or social media every now and then. So for normal use, you're still not going to have to worry. Now for the software, unfortunately with this phone, we are only getting Android 12, which is probably really the main drawback here. Sure, I know when it comes to lower end phones, some people really just don't care about that kind of thing, but at the same time, I mean, if you're going out of your way to get a new phone anyway, you might as well get one that has a slightly newer software. And we are in Android 14 at this point, so make of this what you will. Some people might not really care, but if the software is important to you, it is something to think about. And honestly, again, the Cricket Magic 5G is pretty much the same as this phone, but it has an Android 13, which granted still isn't Android 12, but it's closer at least. So I feel like if you were gonna get this phone, you might as well just get the Magic 5G. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if this phone is discontinued in a month or two anyway. And again, it is pretty much the same, so definitely something to think about. Also keep in mind, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, keep in mind, with this phone, you can use that feature no problem. Another thing I do want to go over here is the materials. As you would probably expect, it is made entirely of plastic, except the glass display of course, but yeah, everything else is plastic. And not only this, but the plastic here feels a little bit cheaper, which again is really not surprising considering this is a carrier branded phone you can get for well under $200. But my point is, although if you're looking at a phone like this, you're probably not looking for anything premium per se, it's not going to be nearly as durable as a much higher end device. So if you do get this phone, I definitely recommend getting a case too. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Cricket Innovate E5G about a year after my original review. Now, I kind of have mixed feelings here because on one hand, it's definitely not a terrible phone if you're really just looking for a super basic device for more basic activities. If you're not going to be on your phone all day watching videos and doing stuff like high performance mobile gaming and things like that, and maybe you don't really care about having the latest software or a super fancy camera with a bunch of features, then in that case, I feel like this phone will still be a perfectly fine option. But at the same time, again, the Cricket Magic 5G, which is, I guess, the successor to this phone, it is pretty much exactly the same, but it does have a newer software, and it has a slightly nicer display too with a higher refresh rate. And despite those differences being honestly kind of subtle, considering the price is essentially the same, I feel like if you're gonna get this phone, you might as well just get the Magic 5G, so definitely keep that in mind. But honestly, if you really just don't care at all and you happen to be getting this phone for free or something, maybe you're just at a store and this is what they have and they don't have the Magic 5G, honestly, you're really not gonna miss out on much. So in general, if you are looking for a super affordable basic 5G phone, then I do think even at this point, a year after my original review, the Cricket Innovate E5G is still at least worth considering. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.